A apresentação delas é sobre... O título é Policiando o Sexo, Relações da Polícia com Trabalhadores Sexuais na África do Sul. A Índia é diretora do Damon K. Law Collection of African American Legal History. Ela foi anteriormente advogada do Programa de Justiça Racial da American Civil Liberties Union, do National Legal Department. E ela atua na área de litigância com advocacy nos temas de ações afirmativas, seletividade racial e desafios para o fluxo escola-prisão. Obrigada.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak today. I'd also like to thank my fellow panelists for their insights. The title of my talk today is Policing Sex, How Notions of Public and Private Impact the Policing of Sex Workers in Johannesburg. I think Prabha has provided us with a nice theoretical framework for thinking about work, particularly sex work. And so what I'm going to do is show some of the insights that you get when you adopt a legal ethnographic methodology. So it's a very localized approach, and it's a case study. But I think some of the insights are also applicable here in Brazil as well as in India. And the research I've done is focused on the policing of sex workers in Johannesburg, South Africa. The methodology that I used was legal ethnography. So I participated in participant observation. I was working with sex workers as well as working with police. I conducted informal interviews as well as semi-structured interviews. And it was a multi-site study. So it was focused on Rosebank, which is a northern suburb in Johannesburg, as well as central Johannesburg, which is located near the CBD, as well as Hillbrow in Johannesburg, which is another urban center. Just to provide you with some of the legal background, sex work is currently criminalized under the Sexual Offences Act in South Africa for both the sex worker and for the client. However, I think it's important to note that in South Africa, we have a very developed human rights framework where there's a recognition of the human rights, the values of human rights, and it's interesting to see how that plays out within South Africa, given that sex work is criminalized. Policing in South Africa has adapted to address contemporary challenges, and these adaptations, particularly in the policing of sex workers, are often outside of the law. In South Africa, sex workers today are policed under a set of unwritten rules, guidelines, and licensing agreements, resulting in a sort of de facto decriminalization for sex work. This approach to policing sex work appears highly localized and creates a complex sex work geography in Johannesburg, involving a host of actors, including the South African Police Service, Metropolitan Police Officers, private security services, female sex workers, transgendered sex workers, non-migrant sex workers, migrant sex workers, and clients running the full economic gambit. In general, sex work appears to be tolerated so long as it occurs on the police's terms. This isn't inherently problematic, but it becomes problematic where the police fail to exercise restraint in creating the terms of these implied contracts with sex workers. These rules are often dictated by understandings of the private versus the public, and the particular police station's approach to enforcing the law in these spaces. The very geography of sex work in Johannesburg is socially produced and dialogic with the various understandings of public and private policing. Sex work frustrates the public and private dichotomy, and it's making the presumably private act of sex into a public transaction. Sex work occurs in spaces that are marked by their private and public tensions. On the one hand, while the act of the purchased sex occurs in private areas, the procurement of strangers for sexual activity is necessarily a somewhat public act. In order for there to be an efficient market for sex, there must be a public or quasi-public space where sex can be purchased by strangers. So this map highlights some of the areas where sex work takes place in Johannesburg, and I focused on 3 areas. At the very top, you'll see it's around Oxford Road, and it's the Olovo and Rosebank area. In the middle, where you see 34 minutes marked, that is the beginning of the Rosebank area. When you look further down, you see Hillbrow Police Station, and that's around the Hillbrow area and where there are Hillbrow brothels. And at the very bottom is where is central Johannesburg. Sex work is concentrated in these red light districts around Johannesburg, and it has a distinct character depending on the locale. Rosebank and Ilovo, so the top area, are located in Johannesburg's northern suburbs, and much of the sex work there is considered to be higher end. Sex work hotspots are on or near Oxford Road, so that's the road that's highlighted on that map, and it's a main thoroughfare in the area. The sex workers cater to clients from the surrounding suburbs, including Parkhurst, Greenside, and Houghton, which are some of the wealthiest suburbs in Johannesburg. One sex worker had explained to me that while she lives in Hillbrow, which is near the Hillbrow police station, she comes to Rosebank to work because the clients are high income and tend to make frequent repeat visits. Almost all of her clients are married, and the convenience of purchasing sex near their homes allows them to discreetly purchase it without traveling far. The market for Rosebank Ilovo sex work is primarily street-based. Sex work is marketed in public spaces in Rosebank, but on most evenings, the sex workers hide in dark street corners and maintain a certain level of discretion. By contrast, in central Johannesburg, so the very bottom of the map, sex work is highly visible and street-based. While a busy night in Rosebank might involve at least 120 or 130 sex workers outside, one particularly busy night on a summer night in central Johannesburg easily involved over 300 sex workers lined up on one brightly lit street of many streets. This form of sex work occupies a very public space. In Hillbrow, street-based sex work is not tolerated at all, and sex work takes place in various hotels, clubs, brothels, and private residences. This geography of sex work involving a public but discreet form in Rosebank, highly visible form in central Johannesburg, and completely indoors form in Hillbrow is socially driven by police practices, client preferences, and sex worker preferences. During the course of my talk, I'm really going to focus on the practices that take place in Rosebank. And so here is the full map of the Rosebank area, and it's really centralized around Oxford Road. The distinction between public and private influences the approaches police adopt in policing of sex work. Sex work that occurs in public spaces is viewed with suspicion and generally disdained, although frequently tolerated. In Rosebank, the police appear tolerant of the sex work there because it's not as overt as that in central Johannesburg and appears to be semi-private. During the early stages of my research, on July 5th, 2013, I went to the Rosebank police station around 6 p.m., the time when the officers changed shifts. There was a bit of activity at the station with a couple of customers filling out accident reports and insurance papers as the officers were assisting them. I patiently stood on the line, waiting for my turn, at which point I explained that I was conducting research that evening and would be joining the officers on their patrols. When I joined the officers on their patrol that evening, we drove down Oxford Road and were slowly patrolling for sex workers on the street. The exercise seemed a bit artificial to me, but I realized that there might be some insight to gain from it. Through regular patrols like this one, I personally witnessed the fatigue, exhaustion, and ordinary challenges of engaging in police patrol work. After loosening up a bit, the officers informed me that evening that the police no longer police sex workers. There was a national directive prohibiting the arrest of sex workers. They stated that sex workers were no longer a police priority and insisted that I would not see much during the course of my 1 year of field work with them. They had to now respect the sex workers' human rights, they would say to me. When I asked them what they thought about sex workers, one officer addressed me. He paused and chuckled for a moment. He stated that they were generally women who really needed the money and were out on the streets for necessity. He stated that he knows several of the sex workers from Rosebank and that they were quite familiar with him. After going up and down Oxford Road a few times, patrolling and watching the sex workers, we headed back to the Rosebank police station and called it a night. In between the officers' sly grins and chuckles, I could infer that many police members are quite intimately connected with the sex workers. While one might ordinarily be concerned by this, such regular connections appear to foster positive interactions between the sex workers and the police. However, these connections were contingent upon the understanding that the police officers, if they were going to be clients, had to pay the same rate as any other client. The general policy at the time of the Rosebank police was to ignore sex workers working around Oxford Road at this time. Police members, including the head of Visible Policing, acknowledged the illegality of the Sex Workers Act, but informed me that sex work simply was not a police priority. There were robberies and other serious crimes in Rosebank that demanded their attention. The police could no longer devote their precious resources to the issue of sex workers in this jurisdiction. The quote-unquote ladies of the night, as he would often refer to them, were thus left alone. However, following the December holiday period in 2013, the relationship between police and sex workers around Rosebank began to rapidly deteriorate. Sex workers informed me that the police had shifted their energies toward their clients. The police had begun to extort the clients that they found soliciting sex workers. This endeavor became so lucrative that patrolling officers would spend time at known sex work hotspots waiting for clients to finish with sex work transactions so that they could engage in their scheme. This practice mimics the provisions of the so-called Swedish approach to sex work and is focused on the policing of clients while disregarding the conduct of the sex worker. The possibility of supplementing the police officer income, which most police officers viewed as wholly inadequate at supporting a family, became too much to resist for many officers. This was a radical shift from the previous strategy of ignoring sex work to focus on more serious crimes. Police attempted to partner with sex workers to extort their clients, but most sex workers refused such arrangements as it would compromise their very livelihood and it was not worth the associated risk. While the police did not return to arresting sex workers during this period of intense client scrutiny, their demands on the client began to severely upset the delicate market that existed in Rosebank. The clients who purchased sex from Rosebank were ordinarily married, mostly white, and middle to upper middle class men. They frequented Rosebank because the sex workers who operate there are reputed to be, quote unquote, professional and, quote unquote, beautiful, and the location was conducive to relative invisibility. The location of Oxford Road is near several of Johannesburg's wealthy northern suburbs and allows clients to be stealth in their purchase of sex due to its proximity to their homes. The sex workers in Rosebank are also less visible than those operating from central Johannesburg. They generally are careful to be discreet, remain hidden under shadows and in dark corners, and repeatedly brag amongst themselves that they are true professionals. Accordingly, Rosebank attracts a wealthy clientele, and the Rosebank police were highly sensitive to this fact. As a perverse manner of getting around directives prohibiting the arrest of sex workers, police began targeting sex work clients, creating some devastating consequences. As this corruption intensified, police began demanding up to 7,000 rands, or the equivalent of $700 US from clients, threatening that they would report them to their wives. The illegality of sex work had very little impact during these conversations. It was a negotiation whose currency was morality, and it was driven by the client's fear of exposure to their wives and families. As one sex worker recounted, quote, "Right now, they took 1,000 rands from a client. When the police get money, they don't share. The client can come back, and the client can be dangerous." In February 2014, another sex worker informed me that she, quote, "had a client with a gun, and he was extorted by the police. We went outside to do business, and the police were waiting outside. They asked for bribes and say that you must pay to stand on this corner. You must pay, pay, pay. I wouldn't be standing here if there was another job. I'm the breadwinner for my family. I have kids. I was going with a client, and I see this guy has a gun. They took money from him and asked for my share. And when I asked for my share, they only gave me $20 when they took 1,000 rands from him." Dozens of sex workers during this period of time of February 2014 informed me that police stopped arresting the sex workers and have been engaging in these extortion schemes instead. They were targeting the clients. As one sex worker proclaimed, quote, "Before they would arrest girls, now they arrest clients. They don't ask the girls for money usually. They focus on the clients. The clients are scared," quote, end quote. However, the focus on clients had impacts for the sex workers in the Oxford Road area. Clients were directing their anger at the sex workers and had even shot rubber bullets at sex workers, accusing them of working with the police on multiple occasions. The clients were hesitant to work with sex workers and suspected that they were in cahoots with the police. Many women vowed not to return to Rosebank because of this, and until as recently as August 2014, the streets of Rosebank were nearly empty, with very few sex workers operating on any given evening. In early February 2014, I counted over 100 sex workers outside one evening before the scrutiny really intensified. The day following a night of very intense police scrutiny, I could only find 2 sex workers outside on the streets, both of whom appeared to be new to Rosebank. If nothing else, this experience indicates that upsetting the market for sex work can reap devastating consequences. The Swedish model to sex work looks inadequate and is focused on client criminalization because clients can always turn their gaze on the sex workers. Besides, sex workers need clients in order to work. If one half of the transaction is criminal, the sex workers cannot freely work. The quasi-private nature of sex work encourages informal rules to be adopted that shape how police deal with sex workers. These rules adopt legal language in its use of license and threats of possible arrest, yet it is a perversion of the law. It is often motivated by greed as an informal manner to share in the profits from sex work. Police officers appear cognizant of the legal mandates and have adapted methods to bend around them. In the Rosebank scenario, the police corruption was excessive. The law worked in its encouraging police officers to formally, quote unquote, respect sex workers and not arbitrarily harass them or arrest them as they had done in the past. However, the police found a fail-safe to get around these legal requirements by focusing on the clients and exploiting the general conditions of sex work. So I think what this case study really does, and it starts to work towards what Prabha is suggesting that a legal ethnography can do, is mapping economic labors in its different shapes and forms. It highlights that the particular context is very crucial to understanding what may be appropriate, as well as some of the unintended, possible unintended legal consequences of legal reform. Right, thank you.